Hello Flight Simmers and welcome back to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. In today's lesson, we'll finally be talking about how to get your aircraft back on the ground. We'll look at the technique for performing a normal approach and landing, and we'll also look at what to do when a landing or approach doesn't go according to plan by introducing the go-around. For this lesson, we're going to take a little break from the fields of Arkansas and head for the bustling traffic and big airports of Dallas, Texas. We're going to set this flight up as a mini cross-country from Dallas Executive Airport to Lancaster Regional Airport. I've chosen these two airports for a number of reasons. First, both airports are of a similar size to Pine Bluff, where we've done our initial training. While Executive has more than one runway, that doesn't matter so much for takeoff, and Lancaster has just one piece of pavement. Second, the airports are pretty much lined up with each other, so minimal maneuvering is required to set up for a nice long straight-in landing on runway 13 at Lancaster. Third, it's relatively easy to navigate between the two airports. There are lots of landmarks, particularly if you're using Bing satellite imagery, that you can use as references for making your approach. The light-colored runway at Lancaster also makes it easy to spot. Fourth, the distance between the two airports is only about 10 nautical miles. The flying time in the 152 is between 8 and 9 minutes from the time you advance your throttles to the time you touch down, so you can get in 5 or 6 landings in an hour by repeating the flight if you want to. You can also save the flight once you've leveled off to save even more time. All right, so let's talk about setting this flight up in Flight Simulator. And just like our first flight, we'll work left to right to get everything set up. So we'll take a look at the airplane first. Aircraft selection, obviously we're using the 152. Liveries doesn't really matter. And then weight and balance, we'll go with a full tank of gas, 2 full tanks of gas, and we'll stick with the 2 170-pound occupants. Don't need any failures, and ATC options is your discretion. For the flight plan here, we will select Dallas Executive, which is Kilo Romeo Bravo Delta. Select that, and we'll use runway 13 for our takeoff. And just to have it available in the VFR map if we need it, we'll put in Kilo Lima November Charlie, which is Lancaster Airport, Lancaster, Texas. Select that, and we will go with runway 13 there. All right, so let's go ahead and set up our flight conditions for this flight. Just like the other ones, we want multiplayer off, air traffic off, and weather to custom. We want the clear skies theme, and then we're going to set the date as mid-December 22nd, 23rd is fine, and we're going to roll the clock back to about 10 in the morning. And the reason we're changing this from our June day at noon is because the lighting is a little bit better for landing in Lancaster. If you choose June about noon local time, the way the sun shines on the runway, it's hard to see the runway markings. So this gives us a lighting condition where we can see the airport pretty good from a distance, but we can also see the runway markings when we get a little bit closer. So we've got it set up at 10 a.m. December 22nd, 23rd, something like that is just fine. And going with clear skies theme, and then we will also delete the wind layer just like we did with that first flight because we don't want crosswinds or tailwinds while we're trying our first landing. That has us pretty well set up, and we will go ahead and hit fly. All right, so let's talk about the procedures we're going to use to fly this flight. Prior to performing the flight, it's important that you're comfortable with and proficient at normal takeoffs, level off, and straight and level flight. If you're new to the channel or to flight sims or aviation in general, I have several lessons on fundamental maneuvers to practice in the 152 before you attempt landings. But the most important for this video is the portion of VFR Lesson 1 dealing with normal takeoffs, level off, and straight and level flight. I will not be covering those maneuvers in detail in this video, so if you're not familiar with them, I'd recommend watching that lesson first. To set yourself up for this approach and landing in Lancaster, you'll want to perform a normal takeoff from runway 13 at Dallas Executive. As you're climbing through 1200 MSL, you'll want to make a gentle left turn to a heading of 120 degrees. Perform a normal level off at 2,000 feet MSL. Once you've leveled off, trimmed out and stabilized in straight and level flight, you can save the flight for future practice to knock off a few minutes off the front end of the flight and get more landing practice in if you want to. And after you've leveled off, it's time to start looking for landmarks to line up the approach at Lancaster. After you level off, you should see a warehouse type building, a single building just to the right of your nose, and a set of warehouse buildings just to the left of your nose. To line up for the approach at Lancaster, you want to fly right in between these two sets of buildings. You'll notice Interstate 20 running from west to east just to the left of your cowling as well. As you fly a little further, you'll notice a set of buildings just past and in the middle of those two sets of warehouse buildings. These buildings have a small kind of decorative lake on the northeast corner of the sets of buildings. This is actually a small college campus in the southeast side of Dallas, and to line yourself up for the runway at Lancaster, you want to fly right over the middle of that campus. At this point, you should be able to start seeing the runway 13 at Lancaster, come into sight just below the horizon. Once you cross Interstate 20, it's time to start configuring the aircraft for the approach into Lancaster. So let's talk about the procedure for setting up the 152 for a straight-in approach. While the MSL altitudes listed here are specific to Lancaster Airport, the general procedure will work for any airport. First, we want to apply carburetor heat and reduce the power to about 1900 RPMs. As we do this, we'll pitch to hold altitude, trimming as needed. We'll allow the aircraft to slow. At 85 knots, you want to extend the flaps to 10 degrees, and then we'll pitch for 80 degrees, trimming as needed to maintain that speed. We'll adjust the power for a 300 to 400 foot per minute descent. You'll find that about 1900 RPMs should give you pretty close to that. And you'll actually want to be closer to 400 feet per minute right now because of our faster speed. As we cross through 1700 MSL, which is about 1200 feet above field elevation, or AFE, we'll extend the flaps to 20 degrees. At that point, we'll pitch for 70 knots of indicated airspeed, and again trim as needed to maintain the pitch that will maintain that speed. Again, if necessary, adjust the power to maintain the descent at 300 to 400 feet per minute. At 1500 feet MSL, or about 1,000 feet above the field, we'll extend the flaps to 30 degrees. We'll pitch now for 60 knots, which is our final approach airspeed. Trim is needed to maintain that 60 knots and adjust the power to maintain that 300 to 400 foot per minute descent. At this point, it should be a little closer to 300 feet per minute, and you may actually need to bump the power up a little bit to around 2,000 RPMs to maintain that descent rate. Once you get the PAPI in sight, you want to go ahead and track that PAPI glide path. After we are configured and stabilized on our approach speed and our descent rate, you want to complete the before landing checklist. Unfortunately, Flight Simulator doesn't give us a before landing checklist for the Cessna 152, so we're going to have to make up our own again. The general philosophy on a before landing checklist is to make sure that everything is set up where you need it to be set for a safe landing and also for a potential go-around. In the 152, this is only 4 items, and we'll do them in a flow pattern just like we did our before takeoff checklist and our after takeoff checklists. So the before landing checklist is make sure all the lights are on, with the exception of the dome light. Make sure that your carb heat is on. Make sure that your mixture is full rich, and make sure your flaps are set to 30 degrees. Once you're configured and on speed, adjust your descent rate to stay on the glide path. It's generally best to make adjustments with small changes in power, 100 to 200 RPM or so. If you're low or slow, you need to add a little power. If you're low and slow, you need to add a little more. If you're high or fast, reduce the power a little bit, and reduce it a little more if you're high and fast. Use gentle turns, not more than about 10 degrees of bank or so, to keep yourself lined up with the center of the runway. Continue making adjustments to stay on speed and glide path until you cross the runway threshold. As you cross the threshold, ease the power back to idle. The nose will drop just a little bit, but that's okay. Continue to pitch for 60 knots until just above the runway, about 20 feet or so. As you get just above the runway, gently lift the nose to arrest your descent rate and fly level down the runway. This is called the round out. The aircraft will begin to lose speed and eventually will start to sink. Gently raise the nose to prevent the aircraft from sinking. This is called the landing flare. It may sound counterintuitive, but the goal in the flare is to hold the aircraft a few feet off the runway without touching down. So continue to pitch up to prevent the aircraft from sinking. Eventually, the aircraft will run out of kinetic energy and settle onto the runway. Pitch attitude at touchdown should be a 5 to 10 degrees nose up on the main landing gear with the nose gear still off the runway. So let's take a look at a couple of images of what the sight picture out the front of the airplane is going to look like at a proper touchdown attitude. As you recall from lesson 1, we set up a couple of custom cameras, one primarily looking at the flight instruments and looking outside, and that's the one you primarily want to use for flying your approaches as it gives you the best visibility. And then the second camera was one that was tilted a little bit lower where we can see the flap controls and mags, master switches, carb heat, stuff like that. And I don't recommend flying the approaches in that camera just because it's aimed a little lower and you can't see quite as well outside. We'll also take a look at what the pitch attitude looks like externally. So camera 1 looking mostly at the instruments. This is a touchdown attitude of 10 degrees nose up, and you can just barely see the end of the runway over the nose of the cowling, and then you can see the runway out the sides of the windscreen there. And then on camera 2, I don't recommend flying it because as you can see, the nose cowling covers up pretty much the entire runway and some of the horizon as well. So it's going to be hard to maintain your runway alignment if you use this camera while you're flying the approach and the landing. Looking externally, we can see what this pitch attitude gives us. We can see that the nose wheel has plenty of clearance before it's going to hit the ground. So this is a good pitch attitude for landing, and you also have plenty of clearance on the tail. You don't want to go much above 10 degrees because if you do, you're starting to get into an area where you're risking a tail strike. So here's what the pitch attitude of about 5 degrees nose up looks like looking out at camera number 1. And this is what it looks like at camera number 2. As you can see at 5 degrees, you get a little bit better visibility. Going closer to 10 degrees is generally better, but 5 degrees is acceptable. But any lower than 5 degrees and you're starting to get into flat landing territory. And here's a look at what 5 degrees nose up looks like from the outside. Again, you can see that the nose wheel still has a little bit of clearance. We're not landing on all 3 gear, which you don't want to do. And of course the tail has plenty of clearance. With a pitch attitude of lower than 5 degrees, you can start to get into where you get a flat landing, where you're landing on all 3 gear, which is not proper technique, or you can get into the territory where you're actually landing on the nose gear first, which can lead to porpoising. And porpoising is where if the nose gear strikes the runway first, it kind of jerks it back onto the main wheels, and then that bounces it forward back into the nose wheel, and it starts bouncing back and forth between the main gear and the nose wheel, and looks like a porpoise, which is where the name comes from. Usually, as it's bouncing like that, the oscillations will get bigger, and the pitch pitch deviations will get bigger and bigger until eventually it gets into an attitude where it comes down on the nose, so nose low that it will actually strike the prop and damage the prop. If you get into a situation where you're starting to porpoise, your best option is to add power and just go around. Another thing that tends to happen in the flare is sometimes the aircraft will start to climb a little bit in the flare, particularly if you pull too hard or too fast in the flare, and this is called ballooning. If this happens, you can reduce the back pressure on the stick or the yoke just a little bit to stop the climb, but don't push forward or you'll get yourself into that nose wheel landing territory again. Once the climb stops, just hold the pitch and the aircraft will eventually start settling down onto the runway again. When it starts settling down onto the runway again, you can resume your flare gently until you touch down. Sometimes if the aircraft balloons up a little high, you can start to run out of airspeed while you're still a good ways above the runway. If that happens, you can add a little power for a few seconds to help ease the aircraft back down onto the runway, or you always have the option to go around. Some other common errors during the touchdown or during the flare, including flaring too late or flaring too slowly. If you're coming in at 300 or 400 feet per minute and you don't flare until you're basically on the runway, you're going to hit the runway at 300 or 400 feet per minute. This can result in a hard landing, or it can result in you striking nose first, which can again lead to porpoising. Another error is to flare too early or too slowly or too high. This can cause you to basically run out of airspeed while you're still quite a ways up above the runway and up in the air. You can basically stall the airplane while you're above the runway, and this leads to the aircraft generally running out of kinetic energy and then falling onto the runway, smacking the runway mightily, and usually if you're lucky it will only damage your ego and your fillings. If you get into this situation and you realize you're too high off the runway and you're too slow, you can add a little bit of power to try to cushion the blow, or you can just add full power and go around. As you're in the flare and touching down, you want to control your side-to-side drift on the runway with just very small amounts of bank, no more than about 5 degrees, and you shouldn't need any of that in a calm wind landing. And if your nose alignment is pointed to one side or the other of the runway, you can correct that with your rudder. This will be more of an issue when we get into crosswind landings. You really shouldn't need to do that since we're doing a calm wind landing, and you shouldn't need it if you just have a headwind or a tailwind. Shouldn't really be landing with a tailwind. But you should be able to just touch down straight ahead with the nose going straight ahead and the wings level with calm wind. After you touch down, you want to gently lower the nose wheel onto the runway and then apply brakes as necessary. With the 152, it will, if you got the power at idle, it will roll to a stop on its own pretty well. You don't have to apply a whole lot of brakes, but you might want to do that if you're trying to make a taxiway or something like that, and you just want to get the airplanes, either bring it to a stop on the runway or get it to a reasonable taxi speed to taxi off the runway. Alright, so I've leveled off at 2,000 feet after my takeoff from Dallas Executive. You can see the college campus is right in front of my nose there, and I-20 is coming up off the left-hand side of the aircraft. I'll be passing over that here in a few seconds, and it'll be time to start configuring for the approach at Lancaster. Take a look down there. There's I-20. And so I'll go ahead and start configuring for the approach. I'll bring my carburetor heat on. Pull the power back to about 1900 RPMs, and I will hold the pitch to hold my altitude and let the aircraft start slowing down. So I'm trimming to maintain that pitch. There's 85 knots, so I'll go ahead and bring that first notch of flaps in, and now I'm going to pitch the aircraft to maintain that 80 knots. And you can see I get about a 400 foot per minute descent is what I want here. Readjust that power so it's about 1900 RPMs, and we'll want to adjust the power to keep that descent rate there. Now I'm starting to come lined up with the field there at Lancaster, so I'll make just a gentle turn to line myself up with the field there. Again, continuing to adjust my power so that I get that 300 to 400 foot per minute descent. And using the pitch and a little bit of power to maintain that 80 knots. Starting to get the PAPI in sight. We want 2 whites and 2 reds. That tells us it's on glide path. Can't see details out here, but it does look like we have a red and a white, so it looks like we're pretty close to glide path. Ease off a little more power there, get it to come down a little bit quicker there. Coming through 1,700 feet, I'll go ahead and deploy the second notch of flaps. Aircraft's going to tend to pitch up a little bit when I do that, so I'm just going to pitch it down, and then I'm going to trim it to maintain that 70 knots, and then I'll adjust the power to adjust the descent rate. A little fast on the descent rate, but it does look like I'm a little bit high. I can only see one white light out there, so do about 500 feet a minute to try to get myself onto the glide path. I'm going to reduce the power just a little bit more. There's 1,500 feet, so I'll go and bring out that last notch of flaps, and now I'm going to target 60 knots, and that'll be our final approach speed. We'll carry that runway, that speed right to the threshold crossing. And got 2 reds and 2 whites doing 60 knots. A little fast on the descent rate, so I'll push a little power in there. Once you get that last notch of flaps in there, you'll probably need about 2,000 RPMs on the power. All right, I'm fully configured. I'm pretty well stabilized, so I'll run the before landing checklist. The lights are on, the carb heat is on, the mixture's full rich, the flaps are set at 30 degrees, and the before landing checklist is complete. Another thing I'll mention about flying the approach is you do want to use trim throughout the approach to make sure that you can basically fly it hands off, and you can continue to trim until you get pretty much over the runway threshold. At that point you do want to stop trimming and just control the airplane. A little bit low, so I'm going to add a little bit of power, and the way I correct for this is just to reduce my descent rate, say maybe 200 feet per minute, and I'll go back onto the glide slope, and then once I'm on the glide slope I want to go back to targeting that 300 feet per minute or so. You also notice there's a point on the runway that doesn't seem to move on my windscreen. That's called my aiming point, and wherever that point is on the runway is generally where the aircraft is going to touch down. So I'm keeping my power, keeping my pitch, about 60 knots and about 300 to 400 feet per minute. Looks like it's keeping me on the glide slope. And once we come over the threshold, I'll go ahead and pull the power. Alright, coming over the threshold, so I'm going to pull that power. Nose is going to drop a little bit, that's okay. So I get down to about 20 feet above, I'll fly level down the runway, and then I'll gently pull it back, hold it off, and then finally the wheels touch the runway. It should be about 5 to 10 degrees of nose up trim. Use your rudder once the nose wheel's down to keep yourself lined up on that center line. And you can see the aircraft is slowing nicely without me having to use any brakes, but once you get to a taxiway you want to take, you can go ahead and apply those brakes and get the aircraft down to taxi speed or a full stop, and you've completed your first landing. So our proficiency standards for a normal landing are to be properly configured on final approach. Today on this straight end we'll be configuring at about 1,000 feet, but when we get into traffic patterns we'll be a little bit lower. The FAA doesn't set a criteria as far as altitude that you need to be configured, but again today a little bit below 1,000 feet we need to have those flaps to 30 and get our landing checklist complete. We need to be able to maintain the recommended speed on approach plus 10 minus 5 knots of indicated airspeed. So we'll be targeting 60 knots is the manufacturer's recommended approach speed in the 152. So plus 10 and minus 5 of that is your tolerance there. We need to be able to touch down as a designated point on a runway. The FAA actually gives you plus 400 minus 0 feet. They expect you to be able to touch down within 400 of a point feet of a point they designate. We'll actually give you plus or minus 500 feet here, and we're going to use the aiming point markers at the runway at Lancaster. So those are those big white rectangles, and we'll try to place it plus or minus 500 feet of those, which gives us 1,000 feet of runway real estate to try to put it down on. We need to be able to touch down at the proper pitch attitude and no nose wheel landings. And we need to be able to touch down and roll out on the runway center line. And just like the takeoff, we don't necessarily need the nose wheel exactly on the center line to meet standards, but we need to try to have the main gear at least straddling the center line. And last but not least, we need to be able to execute a go-around if we are going to be outside of standards on the approach or landing, or if the conditions are unsafe because of something we've done or something somebody else has done or something else has done. On a check ride, it is not a big deal if you fly an approach outside of standards, as long as you realize that you're outside of standards and initiate a go-around. Now, if you did, 9 or 10 of them, the examiner is probably not going to pass you that day. But if you do a single approach that's not quite right, if you go around, it's no harm, no foul. All right, so let's talk about what we do if the approach or landing is not going to work out like we have planned. The process or procedure for discontinuing an approach or a landing is called a go-around. It can also sometimes be referred to as a rejected landing or a balked landing in some of the older books. A go-around can be initiated for any reason. It can be anything from you're too high and you're too fast and you don't think you're going to touch down within a reasonable amount of runway and maybe have the possibility of overrunning the end of the runway, or it could be something like another aircraft taxis out onto the runway while you're on your approach. It can also be initiated at any time during the approach. It doesn't matter if you're at 1,000 feet or if your tires are touching down. If at any time you don't like the way things are going, you can initiate a go-around, generally speaking, in a general aviation aircraft. There are some exceptions to that rule. Sometimes in mountainous airports or things like that, it would actually be better to, take the aircraft off the end of the runway rather than impact a mountain in flight. But for the most part, a general aviation aircraft can initiate a go-around at any time. So let's take a look at the procedure for a go-around in the 152. So to initiate the go-around, we will smoothly apply full power and bring the carb heat off to make sure that we have full power. Then we will retract the flaps to 20 degrees. Remember that this airplane does not like to climb with flaps at 30 degrees, even at full power. These things are going to happen pretty much simultaneously. Once we do all that, we're going to pitch for a climb. We do want to maintain airspeed awareness. You don't want to pitch to an attitude that's going to cause you to get close to a stall, but it should be approximately 10 degrees nose up, just maintaining airspeed awareness. Once you get the airplane climbing, you have a positive rate of climb, which is defined as both your altimeter and your vertical speed indicator indicating a climb. Then you can retract your flaps to 10 degrees. Go ahead and set and maintain that climb pitch attitude of about 10 degrees, and you can go ahead and start trimming the airplane as needed to maintain that pitch. After that, it just turns into a normal takeoff. You retract your flaps up to 0 as you accelerate through 60 knots of indicated airspeed. And then just like the normal takeoff, we're going to pitch for 70 knots of indicated airspeed, and we're going to trim to maintain that pitch. Once you get up to 1,000 feet AGL, you can accomplish your after takeoff checklist. It kind of depends on where you're going, how much of that you're going to do. Normally, I would say turn your lights off first if you're going elsewhere, but if you're just going to level off in the pattern and come back around for another landing attempt, you can go ahead and leave those lights on, run through the checklist, and then set up for your next landing. All right, so let's take a look at what we need to do if we want to go around, if we want to discontinue the approach. Either we've screwed up or something has gotten in our way and we need to discontinue the landing. So we'll get a little bit lower to do this, get about 100 feet off the ground. Okay, something's happened, we're too high, we're too fast, or there's something in our way on the runway. We've decided we're going to go around. So we'll go ahead and go full power, carb heat in, and 1 notch of flaps, pitch for about 10 degrees. Aircraft is climbing, so go ahead and retract the flaps to 10 degrees. We'll pitch and start to trim for that climb. Aircraft is accelerating through 60 knots, so we'll go and retract that last notch of flaps. Nose is going to want to come down a little bit, so we'll hold it up at that 10 degrees or so of pitch and continue the climb. After that, it becomes just a normal takeoff. We're going to pitch for and trim for 70 knots, and once we get up to 1,000 feet, we can turn off our lights if we're going somewhere else and do our after landing checklist. But if you're staying in the pattern and just going to try for another one, you can just leave your lights on, run through a quick after takeoff checklist, and set yourself up for another landing. So there are some proficiency standards that we have to meet when we are conducting a go-around. First of all, we have to apply takeoff power immediately and transition to the climb pitch attitude. You'll get major points deducted if you don't get the throttle all the way in. Second, you need to configure the airplane in accordance with manufacturer's instructions. In some airplanes, they're going to say you don't need to worry about configuring until you have a positive rate of climb. But in the 152, it's a little different because it won't climb very well with the flaps at 30, so they want you to get those flaps up to 20 degrees immediately so the airplane will climb. Then you need to establish a climb at VY, and we're using about 70 knots in the 152, and our tolerance there is plus 10 minus 5 knots. And then the last criteria is that we are able to maintain directional control. Unlike other maneuvers, they don't specify a plus or minus on a heading to maintain here. They just say maintain directional control. So as long as it doesn't get too far away from you, in the examiner's discretion, then you are good to go. But you should try to maintain probably plus or minus 10 degrees on the heading. If you're done flying, once you clear the runway, you'll want to run an after landing checklist. This checklist is basically to make sure the aircraft is cleaned up and configured for ground operations. And the flight simulator does not give us a checklist on this either for the 152, so we'll steal it from the book and just add one item. Basically, all you want to do for the after landing checklist on the 152 is make sure that your strobe and landing lights are off, make sure that your carb heat is off, and make sure that your flaps are 0 or all the way up. And after you've done that, the after landing checklist is complete. So this concludes our lesson on normal approaches, landings, and go-arounds. If you're new to aviation or to flight simulator, don't be discouraged if you're not getting the hang of landings after a few tries. In the real world, it usually takes the average student pilot 3 to 5 lessons of an hour to an hour and a half long, solely focused on landings, before they start to get the hang of it. It's probably the most difficult maneuver to master in primary training, and it's a maneuver that requires a lot of practice and repetition to perfect. Even with that, even very experienced pilots have a bad landing every now and again. In the next lesson, we'll get into traffic pattern operations. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.